Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us for this webinar on public interest as the driver of new emerging technologies to promote equity. The event is organized by the Journal of Science Policy and Governance in collaboration with New America Public Interest Technology University Network. Thank you to New America for partnering on this with us. The webinar follows the release of a JSPG special issue on the impacts of emerging technologies on inequality and sustainability, which was published in collaboration with the UN Major Group for Children and Youth. Today, we will highlight the work of early career authors from the special issue, pictured here, Morgan, Studi, Farah, and Soeb, who will describe their publications and discuss various aspects around equitable technology. My name is Adriana Bankston. I'm currently the Chief Outreach Officer for the Journal of Science Policy and Governance. And before we move on to the panel, I'd like to introduce Donovan Gutierrez, who is an organizing partner for MGCY and former focal point for its Science Policy Interface platform. He is a research scientist at the MIT Institute of Data Systems and Society. Donovan, do you want to give an opening statement?
Yes, thanks a lot, Adriana, and very much appreciate this joint webinar and the work being done with New America. It's quite an honor to have this opportunity to share the JSPG publication. As mentioned, the focus of the special issue was on the implications of new and emerging technologies on inequalities and sustainable development. So, just to provide a little bit of context for the discussion, technologies have always been around, and we are just seeing a rapid trend towards increasing digitization and other applications of technology. And so a fundamental question that we're asking ourselves as the major group and the larger UN system is asking is, what is the speed of technological change and where are we heading? And so a question fundamentally comes about when thinking about whether technologies are good or bad. And the reality is that they're neither, right? They're trade-offs. And the question is, how do you best evaluate the positive and negative implications? And how do you proactively and prospectively put in place policy measures where you can minimize the risk and maximize the benefits? And so, through this special issue, we really we're grateful to hear from young scientists, young practitioners, to share their thoughts on what types of analyses and policies might actually help guide technology towards public interests. There's this a growing field of mission-oriented innovation. Right, this notion that innovation is not just being done for the sake of. Right? Technology change is not, happening, independent of our actions, right? But we, as society, as institutions, can actually provide a ethical and moral compass to the way that technologies are being designed, developed, disseminated, and eventually discarded. So. That sort of sets the framework of how we approach the special issue. We were very grateful to work with the Journal of Science Policy Governance and eager to see how we can get more young scientists, more young engineers involved in these discussions through published work in JSPG and also through the major group where we have a network that engages in the UN directly. So I'll stop it here and turn it back to you, Adriana, and looking forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you so much for that introduction on the issue. So just a little bit of technical things. As has been said at the beginning, the webinar is being recorded, so you'll see the recording after. You can ask your questions in the chat, and you can direct them to a particular panelist as well. And we encourage you to share about the event on social media. You can tag JSPG and SciPol Journal, New America, PIT, as well as MGCY, and we're using public interest tech as a hashtag for this event. So before moving on to the panel, I just want to introduce JSPG a little bit for those of you who may not be as familiar. JSPG is an internationally recognized and open access peer-reviewed publication. We're also a nonprofit, and we're managed by and for students, policy fellows, and early career scholars from all academic and professional backgrounds. And we really are more than just a journal, because we want to provide an independent platform for young scientists to talk about policy issues and participate in debate and discourse on different areas in policy, science, technology, and others, as I'll show you later. And our mission is to help students and early career scholars from all backgrounds bolster their research and writing credentials in science and technology policy. We encourage them to engage and contribute to the policymaking process at all levels of government, whether that's state, national, international, etc. And we contribute to their professional growth by helping them write for a diverse set of audiences. In addition to the publication, our staff promotes published work via social media, our extensive mailing list, outreach individually, as well as other channels, as you'll see in a little bit. And I want to also show you the breadth of the different types of publications that we publish, as well as the topics. So we publish op-eds, technology assessments, policy memos, analyses, etc. And articles cover a variety of science and technology policy areas. As you can see here, just to name a few: artificial intelligence, STEM education and workforce, science communication, the government, university industry interfaces, and so on. So feel free to check us out at sciencepolicyjournal.org, as well as Disciple Journal on social media. And so part of my role at JSPG as Chief Outreach Officer is to elevate the issues and the authors, as we're doing today, through different events. And so following the MGCY special issue, we have started podcasts to have authors speak about their publications. You can see the event here that Farah and Soab were on, and all the authors from today were interviewed on the podcast. The podcast is called SciPol Soundbites. You can feel free to check it out. We also organize webinars. So I'm showing you in the middle here, we did a webinar with AAAS, Science and Technology Policy Fellowships, around science policy careers. Again, showcasing fellows who are also involved with the journal and how they've used the journal to advance their careers in science policy. We also do training. So we've done a policy memo writing workshop with the National Science Policy Network, as well as partnered on an online course with UC Irvine for this course in science policy and advocacy with other partners. And it's been a fulfilling time to try to advance the mission of the journal through these outreach initiatives. So with that, I'd now like to introduce Dr. David Guston. David is Foundation Professor and Founding Director of the School for the Future of Innovation and Society at Arizona State University. This program also offers a Master's of Science in Public Interest Technology, which is available online, and we will share the link throughout the webinar. David is also an Associate Vice Provost for Discovery, Engagement, and Outcomes within the Julie Ann Wrigley Global Futures Lab. He is widely published and cited on research and development, policy, technology assessment, public participation in science and technology, and the politics of science policy. David was also the founding editor of the Journal of Responsible Innovation and previously served as the North American editor for the peer-reviewed journal Science and Public Policy. Among his many accomplishments, David also served for the National Science Foundation's review panel on societal dimensions of engineering, science, and technology, as well as on the National Academy of Engineering Steering Committee of Engineering, Ethics, and Society. He also co-chaired the 2008 Gordon Research Conference on Science and Technology Policy, entitled Governing Emerging Technologies. And finally, something fun about David: being a huge fan of Bruce Springsteen and Paul Simon. At the top of Dave's playlist is Bruce's cover of John Henry and Paul Simon's Boy in a Bubble. And with that, I'll turn it to you, David.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Adriana, for that generous introduction. Hello and welcome. And again, I'd like to thank the Journal of Science Policy and Governance, JSPG, and New America for organizing this webinar. Again, I'm Dave Guston. I'm from Arizona State University, and I'll be the moderator for this main section of the event. I will begin with some context-setting remarks about public interest technology, and then I will introduce our presenters, all contributors to JSPG, as Donovan had described, who will present their work and then respond to questions from me and from you, the audience. The speakers will have about 10 to 12 minutes to present, and if you have questions, just a reminder, put them in the Q&A or the chat, and they will be prioritized and clarified if necessary, and then funneled to me to ask our presenters. So here we go. So at least one version of our story starts about 2 generations ago when the Ford Foundation helped to create a new field of public interest law. At that time, law students had a hard time conceiving of or training for a career that did not involve being in private legal practice or being in-house legal counsel to a private company. So the Ford Foundation helped create coursework, legal clinics, and other kinds of programs and pathways and networks so that law students and young lawyers could envision working in the public interest in nonprofit and community serving organizations and government agencies and so on. Fast forward 5 decades or so, and now Ford Foundation, New America, and others have come together to recognize that technology, like the law, has an impact on just and equitable society, and that the benefits of technology are more often and more easily captured by private interests, and thus that a vision and set of activities to promote public interest technology are necessary. Over the past few years, Ford and New America have consolidated the Public Interest Technology University Network, a group of now roughly 36 colleges and universities across the United States who are working together to promote the idea of public interest technology, or PIT. A short background paper and blog post from the group, written by folks from Harvard, Princeton, New America, Berkeley, and Stanford, defines PIT as, and I quote, "the study and application of technology expertise to advance the public interest, generate public benefits, and promote the public good." These authors add 3 important considerations related to this definition. The first, and again quoting, is that technology expertise is defined more broadly than engineering. Technology expertise refers to a set of capabilities to create, apply, study, and use new technologies, and an understanding of the core ethical, legal, policy, and societal dimensions of technological change. A second point that they make is that the emphasis is on the notion of public interest or common good, as distinguished from the design of technology or technology policy to advance commercial or individual goals and interests. Government and civil society are seen as playing primary roles in advancing societal objectives, though other sectors often play a role as well. And finally, a third point that they make is that the definition specifically calls out a systematic way of studying technology in the world, including unforeseen and adverse consequences and ways to harmonize technology in society. It is a study of the societal experiences imposed by technological design, as well as ways to use technology design to harmonize and impact governance and society. So I actually like this definition a lot. But as an academic researcher who is often interested in understanding where ideas come from and using that origin to help us understand what they mean, I want to excavate briefly another history. At roughly the same time that the Ford Foundation was promoting public interest law, a young scholar in the emerging field of science and technology studies, Langdon Winner, was completing a doctoral dissertation that would turn into his book, Autonomous Technology, published in 1977. In that book, he posited not just an analogy between law and technology, but an identity, that law and technology are both things that help guide and structure how individuals and groups pursue their vision of good in the world. And like Pitt now, Winner then went a step further, arguing that if we hold the legitimate creation of laws to a set of democratic processes and participation and norms, then why shouldn't we hold the legitimate creation of technology to that same set of democratic practices? Thus, the tweet-length version of Winner's argument, no innovation without representation. This is not to say that Pitt is old hat. It is good and necessary for precisely the reason that, however pithy no innovation without representation is, far too little progress has been made on the agenda of assuring that knowledge-based innovation will serve the public interest over these intervening 5 decades. It is also to say that there are different kinds of like-minded or cognate concepts out there, potentially working in concert with PIT, including ideas of responsible innovation, tech for good, anticipatory governance, and even private sector concepts that go beyond corporate social responsibility, like the idea of kaiteki from the Mitsubishi Chemical Holdings Corporation, which understands that the future for private companies is limited if they cannot demonstrate that they create public value in addition to creating private value. Now, as Donovan said, all our speakers who were contributors to the May 2020 issue of the Journal of Science Policy and Governance have all made fascinating contributions to this study and application of technology expertise to advance the public interest. They each have worked in different political or policy concepts in different countries across different technologies, and have even, I think very much to the journal's credit, used different literary forms to present their work. They thus represent a great strength of PIT, its breadth and its ambition, as well as both its caution and its optimism. So now on to our presenters. Our first presenter is Morgan Livingston. Morgan is a senior at the University of California, Berkeley, studying technology policy and data science. She's also a research assistant with Stanford Law's Center for Internet and Society. She will be talking about preventing racial bias in artificial intelligence, AI, in the United States federal government. And I like to include, as Adriana did for me, a sort of fun fact to help personalize this relatively remote and impersonal technology of Zoom. The personal fact that Morgan shared with us is that she used to perform in the circus as an aerialist. As a reminder, if you have questions, please put them in the chat or Q&A, and we'll get to them after all the speakers. Morgan, the Zoom is yours.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you for the introduction. And I am going to begin sharing my screen. So first, I'm excited to be speaking with you today about preventing racial bias in AI systems used by federal agencies. Now, in our current moment, this is especially prescient as we confront both racial inequities in America, as well as a pandemic which has sped up our digitization. So that right now we ensure AI reflects our values of fairness. Now, US government agencies are increasingly adopting AI for tasks ranging from setting bail to even detecting fraud, effectively delegating power to the rules expressed in the algorithm's code. But the reality is that AI is not a neutral technology. It is a tool built and used by humans and risks not only replicating, but amplifying biases. Now, preventing AI bias is an interdisciplinary task. And so today I'm going to talk with you about the technical, social, and policy dimensions and propose a way forward that's rooted in the human element. Now, the US has invested very heavily in AI development, and we are steaming ahead in implementing AI rooted in an R&D forward approach. So according to Oxford Insights Worldwide Index, we are, our government agencies are the most prepared to implement AI. And currently, out of 142 of the largest federal agencies, 45% have used or have considered using AI. But while we seem to be steaming ahead on implementing AI, we are only number 24 on the responsible use index. And of the 64 largest agencies that are considering using AI, none have established protocols to assess the potential impacts of bias. Now, AI promises agencies accuracy, efficiency, and scale, and is often promoted as a cost-saving measure. But the reality is that AI learns from the patterns in data and the objectives set by designers. And the benefits of scale also go to amplifying potential risks and bias. Now, AI is shaped by decisions across the technology's lifecycle, an iterative process of defining the problem AI addresses, deciding to use AI, as well as looking at the design, the coding, the testing, deploying, as well as maintenance and retiring the AI system. And at each of these points, there is risk of embedding human bias. Now, AI has already caused disparate harm. We have seen this in healthcare, criminal sentencing, facial recognition, and a discriminatory loan algorithm. One healthcare algorithm responsible for 200 million people systematically prevented almost 30% of eligible Black patients from receiving additional care. And then in the Compass criminal sentencing algorithm, which received wide press, historic discriminatory practices were amplified. Now, what are some of the causes of these biases? Now, biases can enter at many points in the life cycle of AI, but three key points that I would like to highlight are training data, the design, and the use. Now, AI is trained to create predictions about future data based off of training data. Now, this data acts as a snapshot of society, and when that snapshot captures historic inequalities, there is risk that the AI will learn to replicate these same inequalities. So, for example, some predictive policing software uses data on past location of police responses to predict future locations of illegal activity. Police response data is an inaccurate predictor of illegal activity and often overrepresents communities of color. The algorithm flags these historically over-policed areas for future police monitoring and creates a positive feedback loop reinforcing racially biased policing. Additionally, AI predictions are more accurate when the model is trained on large amounts of data. However, datasets often fail to represent the diversity of populations that will be affected by the output. So for example, when a facial recognition system is trained on a set of photos that are primarily white and male, the system will be better at matching white male faces and worse at matching Black female faces. Now, in addition to the data, is the process of design. There is a crisis of diversity within AI technologists. At Google in 2018, only 2% of the technologists were Black, and at Microsoft, only 3%. Meanwhile, while AI and data science has exploded as a discipline, one study has shown that the percentage of women going into AI roles has remained stable. Next is that AI must interact within a specific context. And there are often social inequalities within specific systems that require domain expertise. So, for example, the widely used healthcare algorithm that systemically gave Black patients lower scores, the reason that it gave lower scores was because the designers used past healthcare costs to predict patients' future level of illness. Now, Black individuals historically have lower healthcare costs due to unequal access of care, and this inequality was replicated in the algorithm's prediction. If stakeholders and experts familiar with both Black communities and the healthcare history had been involved in assessing the algorithm, this bias may have been identified prior to the algorithm's deployment. Lastly, are issues in the use of AI. Now, there are many different levels of AI complexity, but some AI systems, for example, neural networks, are so complex that it is impossible for designers to fully trace why a specific system made a decision in a certain context. Additionally, trade secret protection allows the algorithm's code to be held proprietary, preventing auditing. Lastly is the risk of automation bias. Humans tend to place too much trust in automated decisions in spite of contradicting evidence, which can lead to staff accepting a biased decision. Now, there has been a lot of wonderful work in the AI fairness landscape. Internationally, the US committed to upholding the OECD principles on AI, as well as the G7 and G20 principles, meant to ensure fairness and non-discrimination. The US endorsed increasing the inclusion of underrepresented populations, applying risk management, as well as investing in representative data sets. And the US has come forward with a host of national plans and policy statements which are moving us forward. But now is when the tire hits the road. We need to make sure that as federal agencies are adopting AI, that they have the infrastructure in place and that we uphold our commitments to the international standards. I want to also highlight the work that private sector and the private sector has developed impact assessments to assess for bias, as well as methods to document data sets to examine the provenance and potential under or overrepresentation, as well as tools to track how AI is making decisions. There has also been wonderful work coming out of academia, proposing technical solutions to enforce fairness. However, these technical solutions must be deployed with contextual awareness, as there are many different ways to define fairness with context-specific implications. Now, in my policy memo, I made 3 recommendations. First is increasing the diversity of AI technologists. This is crucial to building diversity into the AI workforce of the future and building representation into AI development. Second is implementing robust impact assessments for bias, which would include auditing the data, programming, and prior testing. And since many AI systems are developed by private companies, then acquired, this would mean building assessments into procurement processes, which has the potential to shift the methodologies of companies developing AI that are interested in federal contracts. And then lastly, it's crucial that the staff that will be in charge of monitoring the AI receives training on how the AI is making a decision, what an output actually means, and then ensuring that they can contest the decision. And I want to thank JSPG for supporting me in this research and providing the opportunity to speak here today. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Morgan. Our second speaker is Studi Chakraborty. Studi is a gold medalist in occupational therapy, physical medicine, and rehabilitation at Christian Medical College, Vellore, India, and is currently working in a brain injury rehabilitation setup. Through her work, she advocates for young people's health with a focus on rights of persons with disabilities, and she has represented her country across various platforms, including at the Global Conference on Primary Healthcare held in Astana in 2018. The personal fact that she reports is that she loves to clean and organize things, even if they're already clean and organized, and that she's a huge fan of Nirvana. She will be speaking about assistive technologies and the divide between the developed and the developing world. As a reminder, again, please put questions in chat and we'll get to them after all of the speakers. Studi.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much for that introduction, David. I will start sharing my screen now. Good evening, everyone. So as David mentioned, I'm Stuti, and I'm currently working in Christian Medical College as an occupational therapist. And this paper is extremely important for me because it's very new and the kind of clients that I work with. And so having this opportunity was truly amazing. I'm going to share my screen now. So the topic that I wanted to address was assistive technologies and the divide in accessibility to assistive technologies between the developed and developing world. And so to introduce what an assistive technology basically is, it can be anything as simple as a wheelchair or something that supports functionality for a person whose hand does not work, or they have a reduction in their muscle power, or they have a reduction because of a weakness in their muscle. So it can be something as simple as something that supports the hand or a part of the body or a limb, or it can be something as really complicated as a piece of electronic control unit, or something like a mobilized wheelchair or a powered wheelchair. So by definition, it can be something which is a piece of equipment or a product system which can be either acquired commercially off the shelf or modified or customized, and which can be used to increase, maintain, or improve the functional capability of a person with a disability. So for people with disabilities, assistive technology is really, really important. This is because there is a lot of global public health burden of disability around the world, and there's almost 1 billion people living with disabilities worldwide, and there are more than 2 billion people that will be affected by non-communicable diseases, as estimated by the World Health Organization in 2018. When we talk about the context of healthcare specifically, I just wanted to cross-check if I am audible and visible.
Yes, Studi, I'm hearing you and seeing your slides.
Okay, great. So in the context of healthcare specifically, the use for assistive technologies is very widespread, and so they can be referred to as health state assistive technology devices. The devices term is used as a broad categorical term, so it does not necessarily have to be a device, but like I mentioned in the beginning, it can be anything as simple as a low-cost device, a low-cost object that you wear in your hand if you have experienced a weakness. So in terms of addressing the perspective in high versus low and low and middle income countries, almost 80% of the people with disabilities in lower and low and middle income countries experience difficulty in accessing the rehabilitative services after they have had some kind of a neurological disorder or some kind of a disorder or a condition or a disease which leads to a disability. So it can be anything that affects your brain, that affects any part of your body. And it could potentially actually benefit a lot of people that are living in these developing parts of the world. And according to literature, also it has been seen that a lot of people that are currently living in the developing parts of the world have benefited in certain countries with the use of assistive technologies. So just to provide you a classification for what a low-income country or a lower middle income or low and middle income country is, it is mentioned over here. It is according to the World Bank classification. For a low-income country, it is GNI per capita of US $1,025 or lesser, whereas for a low and middle income country, it is US $1,026 to $3,995, whereas for a high income country, it is GNI per capita income of 12,376 or more. So you can see that there is a huge divide in terms of the GNI per capita. So in the context of something called as United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which is basically a framework which enlists the regulations for the the empowerment and upholding of people with disabilities. So it entitles all the beneficiaries to access accessible technologies and to ensure full and equal enjoyment of all fundamental freedoms. So it basically, in simple terms, says that any person with a disability is entitled and has the right to get accessibility to all the fundamental freedoms and requires the governments to also act upon them and enforce them. And this was adopted in 2006. However, the implementation of the UNCRPD remains quite far from reality even till date. So some amount of literature review, as well as from my understanding and experience working with people with disabilities, I personally feel that these could be achieved on the basis of certain factors, and these factors range from extensive assessment of individual needs of a person with disability to selecting the correct device which has a correct fit, as well as allowing for treatment, follow-up implementation programs, as well as training, which can ensure the safety and efficiency of an assistive technology. So to give a very small example, when a person is prescribed with an assistive technology, the responsibility of the healthcare worker does not just end there. It extends beyond just prescription or providing the particular assistive technology to the person with disability. It is necessary to ensure that the person who has a disability is able to be receptive of all the components of using the assistive technology. And I will come to this later on my slides. As I mentioned, follow-up after getting an assistive technology in literature has been seen that it is quite lacking in LICs as well as LMICs, which is low income and low and middle income countries, when compared to higher income countries. There's something called as environmental barriers, which are basically barriers in the environment in terms of terrain, physical accessibility. It can be something as simple as the structure of a road or a bunch of stairs which a person cannot climb through when they're on a wheelchair. So these are a lot of environmental barriers that can be difficult to navigate through, and they can cause a major barrier when it comes to accessing assistive technology in the developing countries. So some of the causes of limited usage in developing countries include, first of all, a lack of adequate research. So again, literature suggests that there is a lot of research the research that is concentrated is very skewed towards specific types of assistive technologies, for example, maybe wheelchairs or mobility devices, which allow a person with disability to maybe walk around or move around. However, there's a very low concentration of research currently in literature, which talks about other types of assistive technologies, like those for hearing or visual rehabilitation. The second reason is because of lack of availability of detailed knowledge, either by the people involved in the process of rehabilitation and all the stakeholders and actors that are involved in the process of rehabilitation of people with disabilities to guide an effective policymaking. The third challenge is barriers in accessibility to assistive technologies in specific demographics, like people. Certain studies have shown that the elderly demographic, especially living in high-income countries, have a wider and more receptive acceptance of assistive technology and integration into their life as compared to elderly people living in low and low middle income countries. However, there is a positive aspect to it, and there is hope because certain countries like India, Cambodia, Egypt, and Brazil are especially working really hard to come up with sort of systems and processes to navigate this, and they're coming up with low-cost, effective technologies as well as low-cost, effective production methods for assistive technologies to sort of counter this and pave the way forward for other developing countries. Another perceived challenge is something called as a service delivery gap, which basically means the maintenance and post-delivery services after the assistive technology has been delivered to the particular person. And then there's also something in terms of gender disparity, which is seen quite often when it comes to healthcare challenges or burdens across the field of healthcare. So accessibility is for assistive technology is also seen more among men in terms of gender disparities when it comes to the developing countries. So some of the recommendations based on, again, my clinical experience and understanding that I could come up with, I have tried to summarize here from my paper. First recommendation is to reinforce the role of rehabilitation professionals. There are a lot of rehabilitation professionals, starting from myself, like an occupational therapist, there's a physical therapist, there is a physical medicine and rehabilitation physician, there is a speech or language pathologist, there might be someone called as a social worker, a psychologist. These are just people who are from multidisciplinary fields of healthcare. Then there are people that are working in AI, there are people that are working in development of different types of assistive technologies like brain-computer interface or medical technology and devices that assist people with disabilities. So it is a multidisciplinary team of biomedical engineers, rehabilitation engineers, vocational therapists, which work together to ensure that the assistive technology provided to a person with disability is adequate enough. And currently in most of the lower income countries, there is a traditional approach which is adopted, which is very medically focused. However, it needs to shift to a biopsychosocial approach, which considers the biological, the psychological, as well as the social context in which a particular person is. Then some other recommendations of how this can be done would be to ensure correct prescription, fit, and ensure that when a person is given a particular assistive technology, they are informed about the decision that they are making in order to use the assistive technology. Because an assistive technology can have the potential to definitely improve the quality of life with a person with disability. The second thing would be to sensitize people and reduce the stigma associated with disability. And that is very, very important because it's quite prevalent, not just in developing countries, but also in developed countries. And focus on coming up with low-cost effective forms, which is extremely important when resources are limited. The second recommendation would be to eradicate the importance hierarchy. So just to summarize this, certain technologies and certain types of disability, for example, physical disability, when a person is unable to walk, is given a lot more importance, especially in the developing world, as opposed to something like a hearing impairment or a visual impairment or a cognitive impairment. So how this can be tackled would be to encourage more people with visual, hearing, or cognitive impairments to come forward to act as role models, as well as actors for change to propagate ideas about countering ableism within the society. The second would be to engage in various self-help groups that people with disabilities can themselves form to empower each other, as well as take a stand against things in society and move towards advocacy-related things, and also occupy places in the government and in policy-level areas. So the onus of doing this lies on all people with disabilities, and not just on the people with disabilities, but across all stakeholders. Third recommendation would be to centralize the resource distribution, which is something which is currently in practice in certain countries in Europe, especially in Norway. There would be a single entity which will examine, or which will sort of take care of the entire process of delivery to the assimilation, to the delivery of the assistive technology, right from when it is assembled or manufactured in the factory or a particular place where it is manufactured, till the time it reaches the person with disability. And so something like a central unit of purchases would be really, really important. And adopting a transdisciplinary approach, which involves multiple stakeholders, like people who are developers, distributors, people in academia, people across policy levels, can be involved in this particular process. The fourth recommendation would be to address disparities between urban and rural areas. Even in countries like the United States, there are significant variations in assistive technology accessibility, which have been experienced by people, and this can be taken care of by extensive community-based rehabilitation. So in countries where people do not really have a lot of accessibility, especially in low resource settings where there are rough terrains, challenging weathers, low remote areas, low connectivity to the internet, it is very, very important that human beings are adopted as resources. And that is what happens in community-based rehabilitation, where community health workers or trained professionals are basically just dislodged into different parts or disseminated in different parts of the community to go and tell people about dealing with disability. And finally, the final recommendation would be to treat each individual client holistically, because it is not just limited to the use in terms of using for people with disabilities, but also for other broader aspects of healthcare, education, and administration. And one needs to consider the emotional, psychological status of the client, the language, culture, and traditional belief, values, the expectations of the person. And there has to be a lot of emphasis in terms of feasibility and privacy of using assistive technology. And finally, one needs to also focus, and this is mainly for all the people that are involved, not just the healthcare workers, but all the people that are involved in the production, right from the people that are designing the assistive technology to the people who are prescribing it, that caregiver engagement, user satisfaction, as well as just understanding that using the assistive technology can help the person to improve their quality of life, but not make their disability go away entirely, is very, very essential. So in conclusion, having better access to various forms of assistive technologies would enable a huge population of people with disabilities who are currently dependent on their caregivers to carry out their specific activities for taking care of themselves, or to even participate in daily living, or in fact to participate in any kind of work or activity that they would like to engage in, is limited because of the lack of assistive technologies, especially to address this. So with that, I would end my presentation, and I'm really thankful to the JSPG and the UN MGCY for giving me this opportunity. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Studi. Our final presenters are Farah Awan and Soheb Nunhuk. They both have recently completed the Master of Public Administration in Development, Technology and Innovation Policy at University College London's Department of Science, Technology, Engineering and Public Policy. Farah specializes in delivering access to health technologies, and she is also an eye care practitioner. Farah has a keen interest in global digital health and specializes in health policy innovation and the design and delivery of emerging health-directed technology in these areas. The personal information that she shared is that she loves photography, singing, learning languages, and was once interviewed for a bake-off. Soheb is a member of the Digital Advisory Unit at the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, where his primary focus is on researching and educating IMF staff on digital topics important to the IMF members' countries. Using a framework based on digital building blocks, he manages the practical knowledge that assists policymakers in understanding the impact of transformative technologies and their role in fostering economic benefits while reducing risks. And Soheb shared that he is, contrary to me and to Studi, a fan of classical music and prefers Beethoven and Chopin. So Soheb and Farah, the Zoom is yours.
Thank you very much, David, for the introduction. If we can please have our slides up, please, so that we can get started. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us, everyone, today. So Soheb and I, during our time at University College London, UCL, we were given the opportunity to work on this project by the World Food Programme, that a UN agency, as you're well aware of, recently won the Nobel Peace Prize. So going on to our main slide, please. The next one, please. Right, the Syrian conflict has had a huge impact in the Middle East since 2011. And in 2019, Jordan hosted the second highest share of refugees in the world after Turkey, with around 75,000 people in the Zatari camp and 39,000 in the Azraq camp. Now, the World Food Programme operates in these camps, and as a UN agency, they work across the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly Sustainable Goal number 2, SDG 2, which is zero hunger, and SDG 17 for sustainable cooperation and partnership. The World Food Programme are very actively interested in cash-based transfer systems, which we would refer to as CBTs. And a CBT is a provision of monetary assistance to targeted and vulnerable communities and enables access to food directly, as well as stimulating food demands. Now, there are different types of CBTs, such as unconditional and conditional, as well as different modalities, such as cash or vouchers. And the table on the far right gives a snapshot of all the cash-based transfer systems operating in Jordan in 2019. And the ones in bold are the ones that were deemed to be more sustainable compared to the others, which had a set date. So moving on to the next slide, and over to you, Sohaib.
Thanks, Farah, for the introduction. So at the time we were conducting our research last year, WFP sought us on finding opportunities to further collaborate with UNHCR, UNICEF, UN Women, Oxfam, and Mercy Corps. And we labeled these humanitarian agencies operating on the field as operating partners, since their participation in building blocks would not only scale up the program in a sustainable manner, but also it would avoid duplicating efforts happening on the field. So therefore, this is what you see on screen. We had to understand the motivation for a technology governance of building blocks, how we could act as an ecosystem to coordinate humanitarian aid between these agencies, search for the benefits and the risks of partnering with WFP by joining building blocks, and last but not least, by discussing the ethical implications of blockchain, notably on the type of information used, collected, and used from the end users, which are personally identifiable information, which are collected by the UNHCR and used in an ecosystem called Primes that is actually powering up the building blocks program. And if we can go to the next slide, please. Thank you.
So this slide gives an idea of our methodology and how we went about solving this huge problem. So our aim was to make building blocks a sustainable and equitable and process while scaling it up. And we use a backcasting approach and use a collaboration between UN Women and the World Food Programme as a case study to scale up building blocks and make it sustainable and equitable. And we decided to focus on the components of data and risk for our study. And data is a knowledge transferred through the system, and its management can be used to enhance the credibility and the transparency of the system together with effective risk management. And the end result should be a system that's scaled up, that should want, and other operating partners should want to join in this system and make it further sustainable and equitable. Over to the next slide, please.
Thank you, Farah. So as Farah explained the methodology of our research, we did came across a UN Women paper in June, I believe, detailing the experiences on their co-management of building blocks. And this partnership allowed Syrian women who participated in the UN Women's Cash for Work program. So that is another CBT allowing them to withdraw cash at the supermarket in Jordanian refugee camps or to make purchases directly. And since UN Women and WFP were both validating each other's transactions via their own blockchain nodes, the overall system security was increased. And so from this partnership and UN Women's perspective, we saw how building blocks represented a big step towards blockchain adoption in humanitarian settings because it unified separated cash-based transfers in Jordan. And we've also seen how two organizations with different mandates were capable of collaborating and coordinating themselves to work together. So of course, we saw opportunities and constraints of blockchain, on joining building blocks, on the risks about joining building blocks, and last but not least, on how to manage data with a focus on danger. And from that, we replicated some of the learning outcomes as we extended our interviews with our experts that participated in our research. Thank you. Next slide. So we were not just only interested about the other cash-based transfers programs that were happening in Jordan, but rather their interagency governance mechanisms, which led us to discuss a bit more about the UNHCR Common Cash Facility, or known as the CCF. We found that the CCF had 3 important points. The first is that it had clear engagement mechanisms with its partners, an oversight of member funding, and a clear communication plan between its agencies that are collaborating with the CCF. And so with its differences and similarities, we quickly came to the possibility of merging this system with WFP for multiple regions. And the key thing is that it would not lead towards more duplication of efforts between the agencies, but rather as an attempt to harmonize them between other humanitarian agencies with their respective goals and targets. Next slide, please.
So yeah, can we have the next slide, please? So after we've done this tremendous amount of research and analysis, we divided the charts that we came up were factors which affected the opportunities and constraints for joining building blocks. And we divided those into financial, technical, socio-political, legal, and humanitarian factors. And the most mentioned opportunities for joining the building block systems by operational partners was that building blocks can be used as a platform for collaboration. And the great thing is it's also compatible with existing systems. So it's just really, really easy to get into it. However, the most mentioned constraint was that building blocks is not a fully distributed network, which did pose a bit of a problem. And that leads on to our next slide. And so we'll just go to the risk analysis that we did.
If we can please have the next slide, please. Thank you. So as Farah has mentioned, we needed to conduct a risk assessment to complete our analysis. This risk assessment was interpreted from an operational partner's perspective to truly understand what could be the risks in joining building blocks from his or her perspective. And so this slide represents a snapshot of our risk assessment, and our paper has detailed them in depth, to which we hope that the WFP's Blockchain Steering Committee will take them into account. That being said, it has risks of different degree. All of them they needed attention, especially in the high category, because we've witnessed that the risk could be about a lack of consortia, about the resilience of building blocks, whether if it's only compatible only in Jordan and not replicable in other areas. So this also had some questions on both the short term and on the long term perspectives. And if we can please have the next slide. Thank you.
So based on our work, sorry, Sahab, over to you before we go to the next one.
Yeah, sorry, this is still on my part. So to conclude, we have seen how building blocks holds potential to reach the zero hunger goal. And we have seen the program's blockchain-based approach having multiple benefits, including the enhancement of humanitarian aid in the region. For the WFP, the building blocks significantly reduced the transaction fee involved simply by cutting the intermediary financial service providers, which were necessary at the time. But that ended up, has come to an end thanks to blockchain. And as a result, it liberated more resources for more users. And building blocks also provided refugees more privacy and agency, as their sensitive data were no longer shared by these intermediaries, and their transactions themselves were capable of boosting the local economies. And now Farah will give us an overview of our recommendations from our paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Sohaib. So our recommendations were based on the key metrics of sustainability and equity. And our key recommendation was the formulation of a blockchain humanitarian consortia composed of the World Food Programme and their operating partners to govern and manage building blocks as a private permission network. So having this form of governance championed by the World Food Programme would unify the commitments on building blocks. Another key recommendation was using the UNHCR and UNOCHA in their roles as data aggregator and coordinator to oversee building blocks, which can lead to further transparency and trust and credibility in the system, which will also incentivize potential operating partners to join building blocks in the long term. Now, amongst the other recommendations, particularly climate change is very, very important during these times as well. We know that blockchain can be energy intensive and require high amounts of CPU power. So we recommended renewable power sources. And another key recommendation was how we can use the skills of those operating in the camps, in the UN organizations and other organizations, to provide IT education for young women and build digital literacy in those who may not have the opportunity to access education in the difficult situations in which we're living. And this is a complete list of our recommendations. And that brings us to the end of our presentation. We'd encourage you to read our paper. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Farah and Soheb. So we're going to transition to some questions and answers, and I get the privilege of the moderator in asking the first set of questions. I'm going to go back to the beginning and start with Morgan. And Morgan, you provided in your analysis a set of policy recommendations specifically oriented toward federal agencies to diversify AI technologists, to do impact assessments for bias for AI, and to have some mechanisms for ensuring that decisions by AIs could be contested or validated or verified in some particular ways. And those are, I think, very strong and sound and very focused recommendations applied to federal agencies. Have you given thought to sort of the broader question of assuring the effective public interest technology implementation of AI in society more generally? Are these kinds of recommendations replicable more broadly than in the federal government in the United States? Or what other things would we need to add to assure pit sensibilities in AI across society more broadly?
Oh, thank you. That's a wonderful question. I do think that impact assessments, as well as adhering to standards of privacy, non-discrimination, and fairness, as has been promoted by international standards like the OECD's, are applicable throughout organizations and companies developing AI. But what really needs more attention is the human element. So first, we need to increase ethics training for computer science students. We need to ensure that within development conversations, it's not simply the ethics or compliance teams that are coming in after a tool is built to enforce ethics. We need to empower technologists to ask these questions and explore the social dimensions of the tools they're using as they're being created. Next, I would love to see more robust career paths for technologists to work in public sector and nonprofits, as well as for students to pursue work in tech policy. For example, Princeton's Public Interest Tech Summer Fellowship places undergrads in government internships, and then there's also, I believe IDA has a Science and Technology Policy Fellowship, which create wonderful pathways for students to become engaged in this work. Code for America also offers pathways for technologists to enter more public sector fields. But what I hear often from other undergraduates is that they simply don't know what career options are. They don't know how to engage in technology policy work. They aren't quite sure what the right graduate degree is. So I just hope to see more and more programs like that bubble up. And lastly, I think that we need to look more at modes of data governance. Data is the building blocks of AI, And we need data governance models that both provide access for low resource organizations that are looking to build AI, and that also protect the rights of data subjects and those contributing to the data generation.
Great, thank you. A lot of that agenda, I think, is being played out in the Public Interest Technology University Network as New American Ford have advanced it. And a lot of the work that they're supporting through their PUN challenge, I think, addresses very many of the concerns that you have there. Thank you. Now a question for Studi. I was very taken by both in your paper and in your presentation, the way you put together some of your clinical experience with some of your scholarly observations. And I was wondering if you could sort of explore that just a little bit more, more deeply for the rest of us. It strikes me that that questions around PIT in thinking about, almost as Morgan put it, the human element and the technical element, that bringing the clinical and the scholarly together is a crucial thing for public interest technology activities to be doing. And right now, Studi appears to be frozen. Oh, wait a minute. Are you there? Maybe can somebody unmute her to see if she can respond?
Studi, can you hear us?
Okay, well, while we're waiting for Studi. Oh.
That's a great question, David. So am I audible and visible?
Studi, we're not hearing you very well. Okay, Adriana, would you like me to continue with my questions and hopefully we'll solve that technical issue?
Yes, please go ahead and do that.
Okay. So to Farah and Soheb, this was really a wonderful and rich and very detailed piece, also very nicely focused on a particular technology and on a particular problem area. And I want to invite you to sort of open that up a little bit, if you will, and have you given broader thoughts to, for example, what are the larger set of services that could be provided to refugees, to migrants, to stateless persons in a public interest mode, especially when one considers the anticipation that conflict and climate change will vastly increase the numbers of such involuntarily mobile persons.
Thank you, David. So, would you like to go first?
Sure. I think that blockchain, among other technologies, is capable. I mean, nowadays it's really about putting the user-centric first when you're designing a solution, because it takes into account more than just like the user, but also like the context to which essentially, or to which like the technological solution is supposedly oriented. And I think this is more and more technological innovations are trying to really facet the technology, whether if it's blockchain with WFP or whether it's going to be any kind of disruptive technologies to really on a more, we would even call them transformative technologies, as like their use cases are faceting their technology, like the use cases. Farah, would you like to add?
Yes, David, I think it's really important to make use of mobile phone technologies at present and have low cost, low energy and accessible solutions that don't rely on energy intensive apps. Also, interoperability, I feel, is key, as well as making use of people on the ground who work with those in situations of distress and who could communicate with those in these situations to make applications and technology more relevant and helpful to find those who, those away from their homes who can't go back to their homes.
Great, thank you. Let's see if we can go back to Studi now, and again, inviting the audience to post any questions that they might have in the chat or the Q&A. Have we got you, Studi?
Yes, I'm here. I'm really sorry about the network issues. Am I audible and visible?
You are audible, and that's the most important at the moment.
All right. So I think to address your question, I'm just going to turn off my video. So to address your question, if I'm audible to you now.
Yes, go ahead.
All right, thank you. So in terms of my experience working with in a clinical setting, as compared to the research that I have been doing on the background, I think it was very, very important to highlight the issues and the struggles that are faced by people with disabilities, especially working very closely with them. So in terms of when it comes to something like PIT, which is more, which has more of like a social or a technology for good or a wider, more interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary approach, I think it was very, very important to address how there can be a wholesome approach to making technology more accessible, especially when it is technology to address healthcare needs of people with disabilities. So in terms of the experience that I've got from my clinical background, working with different sets of people or patients in a very low resource setting, where in parts of rural places across my country, where there is a lack of accessibility or knowledge in terms of environmental barriers, physical barriers, social barriers, and a generalized stigmatization against disability, and a lack of understanding about what disability actually entails. So I think it was very important to highlight that assistive technologies can play a really, really important role in changing the life and definitely making the quality of life of a person with disability much better. And like you can see, I'm having network issues right now for some reason, and at least I have a network connection. But in the parts of the country that I work in, there's no remote internet connection. There is no awareness in terms of what disability might entail. So I think it's very important to address these challenges and these issues, especially when working in a low resource setting. Where there can be a lot of difficulties navigating, especially when you have a permanent condition like a disability. And so with my background clinical experience and the research experience that I have been gathering over the past couple of years, I thought it was very important to address this aspect. And I hope that answers your question, David.
Yes, indeed. And I'd actually like to extend that roughly similar question to Soheb and to Farah about the relationship between, in essence, your work and your scholarship in the context of PIT. What is the, if you would reflect on the connection between practice, between clinical work and scholarship around PIT, I think that might be enlightening as well.
Gosh, David, that's a really interesting question. Could you just rephrase that for me again?
So one of the things that I think Pitt puts a finger on is that contextual knowledge is incredibly important for making sure that technology works the way that we might want it to work, that that we understand conditions of use in particular ways such that the users are actually served. And I think that puts a focus on the way that people who are involved in clinical work and the delivery of services in professional interactions and so forth bring their contextual knowledge to the creation of more general knowledge about PIT. So did you see that interplay between, you know, sort of what you knew from your professional work, from your engagement with users in the part of you that did not write this paper with the part of you that did write this paper?
Absolutely. And also this paper is very, it's very close to my heart as well, because my parents are, had to leave their home as well. They were expelled from their country. So sort of having that knowledge with me of, you know, losing your home, being in a vulnerable situation, and also with my background in healthcare as well. It's one of those professions where, although it's quite global, you see people on the ground and you understand that, you know, what their daily struggles are, and you know, all the little bits that, you know, one wouldn't understand if they were in a top end organization such as the UN. You know, you understand on the ground, but also my new knowledge also gave me the policy understanding as well. So I was in the perfect position just to meld the two together to try and understand how, you know, how people are and how the technology would impact them on a daily use case basis as well. So how about that? Is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Yes, of course. I mean, like the both points that were raised, like from David and Farah, I mean, they are essential to really bridging the digital divide, to really connect the people that are unconnected, that I do not have enough internet connectivity. And so that's why both like the top-down approach and the bottom-up actually like are really complementary. So it really is about, you know, measuring like the quality of infrastructure on the ground and starting to focus and have like, you know, targeted approaches on what to focus on first when we're talking about digitalization and PIT. So for example, like at the digital advisory unit within the IMF, we use a framework that we actually call the digital building blocks. And they're upon like 4 building blocks that are essential in assessing a country's digital readiness. And one of them, which is focused on bridging the digital divide, we use a series of indices that are measuring the quality of infrastructure on the ground, whether if it's the access to electricity, and any kind of other variable that we need to know if we need to talk about technologies. And then if we see a lack, then we need to know where to focus on first when we're discussing with IMF staff and other country authorities.
And also, David, I want to add to that, data. You know, just data is such a big thing. It's data's everywhere. Everything we do generates data, and it's something that people don't want to give, but also they do want to give as well. It's one of those tricky things, you know, you want to share your data, but you also want to share it safely. So having understanding of that was, again, yeah, really, really important. And, you know, so you can see the benefits of the data sharing and the data aggregation, and just keep people healthy and safe and make use of that in a way to, yeah, create a better future, a better life for everybody.
So, Farah, thank you for sharing that personal bit as well about coming from a family that was forced out of a living situation. I want to turn back to Morgan, because you introduced the idea of diversifying the AI workforce, and therefore the presumption that the personal qualities, whether they're those kinds of personal experiences, whether they might be ethnic or racial diversity, whether they might be economic diversity, that people carry with them into their professional activities, into their scientific and technical opportunities, do something to the science and technology that gets done. And I wanted to give you perhaps an opportunity to elaborate a little bit on that. Is that the kind of thing that you had in mind, and how is it that we might create structures that are more open to people of more diverse backgrounds to contribute to building public interest technologies, and even more broadly into what I call future building?
Oh, that is a wonderful question. I think there are many different layers to that. From my own experience, I actually transferred from a community college to UC Berkeley. And at a community college, I was part of actually a much more diverse group of computer science students. And as I have moved along, I have seen that decrease, actually. Something that actually initially got me interested in this area was a close friend who immigrated and has very specific concerns about her privacy. And her needs for digital privacy on her communication and social media apps prevented her from being able to participate in things that many other students took for granted, even messaging via Facebook. She is a computer science student, yet I see her continually facing systemic barriers as she tries to go for internships, tries to reach for the next level that would allow her to become a designer shaping future decisions around our technology. And so in her, I see someone who would bring a very unique, well, actually not very unique, but a much needed perspective into the design. So I think that looking at that, there's very much an opportunity to help students from under-resourced and more diverse backgrounds in, getting that first internship and then mentoring them as they go up. I also worked, I think there is also a need for increased mentorship within institutions. So ensuring that there is support within companies to ensure that you maintain the talent.
Great, thank you. I'd like to finish up with a question to Studi, if we've still got you, that relates to this. In a sense, the work that you've described has at its core a question of diversity, a question of people with varying abilities trying to make their way in the world with or without assistive technologies in places that may be well suited or not as well suited for them to get along. And so I guess sort of two questions that relate to that. If you could reflect perhaps a little bit on the relationship between, I guess in your paper you make the distinction between technologies that are sort of internal and technologies that are external or extrinsic in interacting with persons with disabilities or persons with alternative abilities, and where that distinction also fits in to what it is that we create in our environment to enable people to get along or not get along in the world. And so I'm reminded of some very interesting interactions that I had with a scholar and disability rights, disability activist named Gregor Walbring in Canada. And Gregor gets around mostly in a wheelchair. And one of the things that he hates to hear is the language or terminology or construct of confined to one's wheelchair or things like that. He's very much disparaging of a world that sees wheels as a less good way of getting around than legs. And one of the responses that he has when people use the wrong language around him is, well, let's race downhill and we'll see who gets there faster, and then you can talk to me about my disability. So I'm wondering if you would, expand your focus a little bit around the relationship between sort of those internal technologies, those common external technologies that many of us partake in, and the infrastructures that we're building as well.
Sure, that's a very interesting question, David, and thank you so much for talking about your personal experience with people with different abilities or alternate abilities. So I think I would like to answer this question by addressing two things. I honestly believe that the disability, and I have mentioned this time and again, lies in the environment and not the person. So the disability, the environment actually makes it disabling for the person. Like I was mentioning, environmental barriers, architectural barriers, physical barriers, social, cultural barriers, as well as psychological barriers and stigmatization are the major challenges that, as you mentioned, even in case of your friend or other people with disabilities, especially those living in developing parts of the world, tend to face because there aren't as many resources or as many opportunities for engagement of people with disabilities in certain sectors of society in developing parts of the world as compared to developed parts. But even in general, addressing stigma around disability is very, very difficult, a difficult thing to navigate. The other thing would be that I would like to talk about would be to counter ableism. So that's just based around, my understanding would be like the concept of able-bodied people thinking that people who are differently abled or alternatively or specially abled would want their charitable approach, would want sympathy, or would want them to be empathized about, when that is not the case. Our role as as a society as a whole is to empower people with disabilities and to not because they cannot do it for themselves, but because that is something that is a moral responsibility, just like how we would throw our trash into a trash can. But also in terms of just addressing and not being superior about the fact that we are able-bodied, because when we sort of try to underline or define what is normality, then we start addressing people with disabilities as being abnormal. So there is no norm or there is no normality, and it's us who create those norms in society or standards for people to be at par with, and that's when the division comes into play. So I think it's very important. My last point is that it's very important to address the concept of ableism and to try and come out of it and tackle it and make technologies as inclusive as possible for people who have alternative or different abilities, and also not just for people with different abilities, but also in terms of using technology as a whole as a society, to keep in mind that it is something that is accessible across all parts of the world, and also to keep in mind that technology is accessible or implementable in a social context.
Wonderful. Thank you. I think that's a wonderful point to wrap up on. And I'll just thank our speakers again, commend that issue of the journal for you all to look at, and hand it back to Adriana.
Great. Thank you so much. Let me just share the last slide here to wrap up. So thank you, everybody, for being here. I really enjoyed hearing from all the panelists. Thank you, David, for moderating the panel. And thank you to New America for partnering with JSPG on this event. I want to just leave you with a call to action. Please submit your policy research to JSPG by November 15th. That's our next deadline to be able to publish, as well as be able to be featured on webinars, as well as our podcasts. Please subscribe to our podcast. We're on YouTube and SoundCloud. And you can see all the presenters today were interviewed, so you can hear more about their publication on SciPol Soundbites. And to keep updated on our issues and events, subscribe to our newsletter. And also we're on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at SciPol Journal. And thank you again, everyone, for joining, and have a great evening.